The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is something very few Americans know about. But if you're concerned about world peace and the danger of a new war, it's something you should be concerned about. Now, the Quad goes back to 2007 as a strategic informal dialogue between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And back in March, we saw the White House release a statement on behalf of those four countries called In the Spirit of the Quad. I decided to speak with a few experts about this.
Well, it's basically a combination of the four countries, America, Japan, India, and Australia, who share democratic values and want to spread democratic values around the world. And to some extent, as we know, this is a combination of cultural, political, and also military containment around China. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. And we're now starting to see that group become more active and certainly more cohesive in the sort of messages that they're spreading.
Well, the Quad, as it's been become known, is an informal dialogue between Western nations. So, United States, Japan, Australia, and India, and New Zealand has been part of those discussions as well. So I'm talking to you from New Zealand. It could also perhaps be characterized as the NATO of the South in terms of its ideology and where it's coming from.
I think that most people probably think it's a good thing that Australia, being a very small country compared to the other three, is part of a fairly powerful group. And I guess because of Australia's relationship with America, we see ourselves as quite a strong part of that quad group. The public in Australia, does anybody really care about that? I wouldn't say that it was top of mind at all.
I can tell you the threads of what's been discussed is definitely about the looming so-called threat of war in Taiwan, which doesn't really make sense from China's perspective and from Taiwan's perspective. But it is always used as the reason for build-up of American forces in the South China Sea, so there has been a lot of talk about the build-up of the Chinese Defence Force in the South China Sea. There was a really interesting exchange on Twitter between sort of not really directly between, but Mike Pompeo in the previous administration was talking about China's presence in the Antarctica, and China made the great zinger that, well, yeah, China's a long way from Antarctica. America's a long way from the South China Sea. So there's pot calling kettle black. But yeah, that build-up of forces is concerning, and so it's really important that cooler heads prevail.
Now, the Quad statement did not mention China, but simply spoke extensively about the Indo-Pacific region. However, everyone knows that this statement came out amid a huge explosion of anti-China rhetoric from U.S. leaders and media over the last year.
Yeah, China is kind of the elephant in the room that's not being mentioned by name, but in terms of everything the Quad is being set up around is the sort of the doctrine of containment of China, which has very much come from the US.
And is China a threat to these four countries?
It depends who you listen to, and it sort of depends which filters you view that through. So I think a lot of Western people are not realizing that we've been kind of brainwashed as well, in terms of just having this vague awareness that China is a threat. When you examine China, when you examine what China's publicly saying and how they're acting around the world, there's actually a really peaceful intention for mutual growth. That is a very consistent message that's been coming out of China for a long time. Listening to particularly America's rhetoric, on the other hand, there's a sense that this town ain't big enough for both of us, and that the threat narrative is kind of ill-formed. It's not very clear what the exact threats are. The same attitude's being mirrored in Australia, less so in places like New Zealand, which is much smaller and much, everyone's dependent on China for trade. And so the sense of China being a threat is positioned as being a great dependency. We depend on China, and then also increasingly in the last 6 months being a military threat.
Dan, can you tell us what you think is behind the rise of hysterical fear of China we're hearing from U.S. voices right now?
Well, I don't think it's so much fear, though I think they're trying to stoke fear amongst the American population. But I think it's not so much fear as it is concern that China is now surpassing the United States in so many ways. Economically, of course, health-wise, and dealing with the pandemic, they were able to shut it down within a couple months. The U.S. is still reeling from it, possibly expecting a fourth wave. China has proven to have the superior system, economically, socially, health-wise. I think that's the concern, is that the U.S. realizes it cannot compete on a level playing field with China, and so it may be looking for military means to try to do that.
I think that China really doesn't pose any threat to world peace unless you consider giving out generous low-interest loans to help build up Africa's medical and transportation infrastructure as a threat. It's kind of a completely ridiculous question that's often asked by the mainstream media. The U.S. has been at war for 226 of its 244 years. You compare that to China, which hasn't had any major foreign conflicts since Korea, and the question answers itself.
There's a belief in the West that China is an aggressive country that is looking to expand in a military way, and there needs to be some process of containment, and the sort of allied forces who are committed to democracy and see China as a threat need to group together to be a strong, cohesive military group, and that's kind of where it started.
The U.S. has been contesting China in that region, in particular in the South China Sea, for some time. There's a couple things involved. First, the fact that the U.S. somehow thinks it has dominion over the entire Earth, right? So we hear about China's presence in the South China Sea as if that should concern us, or Persia or Iran's presence in the Persian Gulf. Well, that seems to make some sense. But the U.S. thinks it should dominate everywhere, and so that's why the U.S. is in the Pacific, to try to do that. Meanwhile, again, the U.S. sees China's influence in the world growing, influence that China is gaining not by bombing countries like the U.S. does, but by giving countries vaccines and building roads and building trains. And again, the U.S. has no capability or willingness to do those sorts of things, even for its own people, right? And so the only tool it has in its tool chest is military might, and it's trying to flex that in the Pacific to try to somehow rein China in.
I think all Southeast Asian nations are in a very difficult situation, a bit like Australia in a way, except many of them are or have Chinese origins or Chinese populations. They all have China as their number one trading partner. They all see their future being economically tied to China. So they have a very difficult, tightrope to walk, which is to sort of push back in some areas, but cooperate in others. And I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that the Southeast Asian countries, who are generally peaceful countries, who don't want confrontation and want to build relationships, would be quite uncomfortable about the Quad.
This barrage of fake news is constant and all-encompassing. It's not just Hong Kong or Xinjiang, but like yesterday, the website Zero Hedge put out an article saying that massive crowds at cemeteries in Wuhan indicated a cover-up of the coronavirus. Of course, they were referring to a gathering on April 4th, which is called the Tomb Sweeping Day, which is like a super important festival throughout much of Asia. But they were using those pictures to, raise public distrust of China.
Wow. Wow.
I don't need to tell you that China already regards Taiwan as part of China. It's for historical reasons, and I think China will, in the next few years, look for ways in which to integrate Taiwan more thoroughly into the mainland. They've said that they'll do that by force if necessary. I don't expect that to happen. I certainly don't expect that to happen in the short term, because China has shown many ways of providing economic incentives and coercion and threats to bring people into China. And that's what they'll be doing with Taiwan by encouraging them to be part of the amazing China economic growth story. So I don't expect there to be a problem in Taiwan, but I appreciate that the media and some of the politicians are using Taiwan as a kind of trigger point to justify a whole lot of potential military action and or megaphone diplomacy.
U.S. leaders have also worked to undermine the Chinese vaccine. They've accused China of using vaccine diplomacy to win friends and influence across the region. Would you argue that the United States is engaging in vaccine diplomacy?
I would tend to think so, because of the decisions that they're making about who can and who can't get the vaccine, why they can't get it, and what they must do to in order to get it, which is kind of a continuation of US foreign policy around we want to bring freedom to you, and if you do things our way, we'll give you the things you need.
And let me ask, would you argue that China is doing the same thing?
Not to the same extent. China's being a lot more open and free in the way that it's distributing vaccines, and this is consistent with what China says is their policy of non-interference in the affairs of other nations.
Now, is the United States actively trying to prevent people from getting the Chinese vaccine? Is there an effort against it from the United States?
I don't know if that's a concerted effort. There definitely is messaging coming out that's casting doubt on the efficacy of the Chinese vaccine.
Okay. Now, is there a role in social media in all of that? Because I know on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, you are not allowed to question vaccines. So we're hearing, questioning of the Chinese vaccine. Is that happening on social media?
That's a very good question. Social media has become such a battleground at the moment. So there's not only what you're allowed to say and not allowed to say, but there's also the fact that people are getting very tribal in their social media. So if somebody believes something, the algorithms will just feed them the information that they want to hear, they want to know.
Well, I think the first question to be asked is, what is vaccine diplomacy? And in particular, what is diplomacy? To my mind, diplomacy is dealing with other countries in a sensitive and tactful way. So I would argue that the US and the Quad are in fact not engaging with countries in relation to the pandemic and the vaccine in a way that could ever be described as being sensitive and tactful. The vaccine policy of the US can really be looked at from two angles, the political angle and the business angle. From a political angle, then I really see the vaccine being weaponized as a tool to be used for geopolitical ends in order to support allies and target enemies. And from the profit angle, the business angle, well, it really is for the big pharma just another chance to seize on a crisis to make big profits. So there's no examples I'm aware of, for example, of Pfizer handing out tens of millions of free vaccines around the world. It is very much a business, cold-hearted, non-humanistic approach that's being taken. And to my mind, this pandemic is a war. For many countries, it's a huge threat. And during war, veterans will tell you the friendships you make are lifelong and lasting and enduring. And you don't forget those people who stood alongside you during the war. So I contrast the approach of the Quad in the US with that of China, that has in fact given away tens of millions of its vaccines throughout Asia and Africa. these countries aren't going to forget that support. In their time of need, they have received support from China. In their time of need, they haven't received it from the West. That to me is very poor diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy or otherwise. And also, and I think this is something that doesn't get touched on very often, but importantly, China's vaccine is actually open access. They haven't created and wrapped it up in all kinds of IP protection. If you are a country and you have the capability to manufacture the vaccine, then you can do it. China won't be charging. You can just have the IP and do it for yourself. Again, this is a much more humanistic, harmonistic approach to engagement with countries in times of crisis. And I really do wish and encourage the Quad and particularly the government of my own country, Australia, to think on this and reflect on this, and perhaps to reflect Christian values, caring values, and some compassion, and to recognize the need for diplomacy and to help countries in their time of need. Because after all, if we just keep all of these vaccines for the West and all of the poor countries and the third world countries suffer, and the vaccine may mutate to such an extent that when it does come to bite the West, the vaccines may be useless. So let's treat this as what it is, a global war on humanity, and as humanity we need to react in order to kill off this virus, and so it doesn't remain a real cloud on the horizon for many, many years to come.
Social media has cracked down on anti-vaccine rhetoric. If you start, criticizing the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, you can get your account taken down. But yet, a lot of mainstream outlets in the United States have been critical of the Chinese vaccine. What's behind that double standard?
Well, the vaccine industry is a global business game with trillions of dollars on the line. Of course, the U.S. government and social media companies, U.S. social media companies, which act as an extension of U.S. power, are playing on the side of Team America right now. In fact, one of the top coronavirus officials in the U.S., Dr. Anthony Fauci, is constantly railing against vaccine skepticism, but has himself said that he's skeptical of the Russian vaccine.
We know the West is hoarding these vaccines. It's been criticized by both the United Nations and the Pope for doing so. Meanwhile, China is trying to do the opposite, is trying to share the vaccines. Again, one, to gain some influence and some inroads into regions it has not had before, but also there is this notion in China of solidarity with other countries that, frankly comes from the 1949 People's Revolution. I mean, that was always part of the Chinese Revolution, the idea that it would assist other countries in development and in overthrowing their colonial chains. So I think, this is all part of it.
Now, do you feel that the United States and China are competing with their vaccines? Perhaps they are trying to prevent people from getting the other country's vaccine. Is that what's going on?
Well, but yes, I think there may be a bit of that going on. I mean, I know that I can see a day coming when, if we want to go to China, we may have to have the China vaccine. If we want to go to America, we may need to have the American-approved vaccines. I can see that may be brewing. But I don't see much more at this stage.
And what is the motivation behind this competition?
Oh, well, I think it's just global posturing. And I think at the moment we're in this sort of weird period where I think there's a lot of talk and a lot of shouting, a lot of media and a lot of wolf warrior type diplomacy going on. But I suspect that over time, as countries like America and China, and America under Biden particularly, I think will have a different approach to China to the previous administration. I would think that behind closed doors, there will be some sensible talk going on to deal with some of these big global issues. And climate change is a big part of that. So, it's impossible, I think, to sort of criticize and confront China on one issue like vaccines and then want to work with them on another major issue like climate change. So I would hope that there's some sensible discussion going on. If not now, very soon there will be.
To see that, we have to look at what the press did with the Russian vaccine, right? For months, we heard the Russian vaccine was not put through the tests that are, scientifically necessary to prove that it's efficacious and safe. Of course, after many months, we now learn that it's 92% effective and very safe, right? But the press did everything it could to convince people it was not effective. And it's doing the same thing with China. Essentially, if anything comes out of China or Russia, these countries the U.S. views as an adversary, it's deemed suspect by definition. And that's what this is about. And again, the U.S. is concerned about the vaccine diplomacy of countries like China. Because again, the U.S. has no interest in such diplomacy, not vaccine diplomacy or diplomacy of any kind. And again, it feels threatened that China is able to win hearts and minds by doing things like giving others vaccines. So it's trying to undermine that by claiming the vaccines are not efficacious. And it does so without any proof.
While U.S. leaders have been blaming China for the COVID-19 pandemic and making all kinds of over-the-top allegations against China related to many different topics, we have seen a huge rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the United States. Now, do people think this is merely a coincidence?
Well, it doesn't take a social scientist to realize that the hawkish and dehumanizing rhetoric from the U.S. government trickles down. But even more than the U.S. government, the mainstream media exacerbates hate against Asians with its constant barrage of fake news, which is meant to manufacture consent for U.S. aggression. It just so happens that Americans are taking that call for aggression into their own hands.
So recently, our Human Rights Commission did some surveys of different ethnicities in New Zealand. Through the time of COVID-19, people of Chinese descent experienced a great increase in the number of racial incidents, racism incidents, which was really sad, but not surprising. We're an Anglo nation. We have our own sort of history around biculturalism with our indigenous people, and we're not that great at integrating. Having said that, we have Auckland, our biggest city, which is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and so we do have a way of getting on. But in terms of our attitude towards China, the country, I do believe we're doing better than, say, the US or Australia, which are bigger countries and have more of a competitive vibe against China. New Zealand has always been like the Switzerland of the South, and we need to be cooperative just to survive. And so in business, there's a pragmatism. However, that tone is starting to harden and become suspicion towards China, which is a bit concerning.
Look at what the U.S. has done in this allegedly democratic country that allegedly cares about its own people. It has the worst COVID numbers in the world in terms of cases and deaths. I think those things have to be looked at when we judge those two different governments and societies. And again, China looks pretty good from here. And again, the idea that somehow China is an imperialist country trying to dominate the globe, again, I don't see giving vaccines to people or building countries' infrastructure is imperialism, not in the way that certainly the West carries out imperialism, which again is not through that sort of constructive conduct, but through war. So it's incredible, though, people seem fooled by it, that China is somehow a threat. Again, how is giving people vaccines a threat? It's hard for me to even see.
Those who are concerned about peace should find the increased activity in the Pacific region to be disturbing. Furthermore, China is one of the biggest economies in the world by far. So, with Americans losing their jobs and suffering amid the lockdowns and their economic after effects, isolating the USA from China and increased tension between the two countries is certainly not going to be in the benefit of America's working families. those who want a better world should be paying close attention to the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue and what it really means.